When we talk about the nervous system, we really need to talk about nerves. So what we see here are some nerves, and we see three different kinds of nerves in this particular circuit. The nervous system really has three jobs. One is to sense the environment, to monitor the environment. So that's what the sensory neuron is going to do. The second thing that the nervous system needs to do is it needs to integrate, or it needs to process that sensory information and decide what it means. And so the interneuron will do the processing. And then the third thing that the nervous system needs to do is it needs to respond to that thing that was measured in the environment, whatever it happened to be. And so the motor neuron will be involved in the response. So we have sensory function, processing function, and motor function. And in these, you're seeing a couple different shapes of types of nerves in terms of their shape. So up here at the top, our sensory neuron had the cell body off to the side, and then the axon here below it, sort of disconnected in a way. The interneuron here is a little bit more like maybe we would say a standard neuron, but let's consider the motor neuron here. We have a cell body. We have dendrites, that's these hair-like structures coming off, and then we have an axon or a tail. And the dendrites are going to be for sensory reception. So up here with the sensory neuron, these really weren't dendrites, but they were receptors of a similar nature. They were there to pick up any signals that might come along. The interneuron had some real dendrites here to pick up messages, and then our motor neuron had, in this case, quite a few dendrites, and those dendrites basically are listening, they're paying attention to the environment, and should a neurotransmitter come along, then it will be ready to pick it up. Remember in our discussion on muscles, we talked about neurotransmitters being communicators. Communicators either between neurons or between a neuron and a muscle cell. And in this case, we're talking about communications between neurons. And there are over 100 different chemicals that are considered to be neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is probably the big one in the bunch because it's so involved in muscle contractions. But there would also be things like dopamine and serotonin and adrenaline and things like that you've heard of before that are also involved in this communication process as well. Your textbook has a discussion on some of the different neurotransmitters, sort of an introduction to that. When you think about a nerve in your body, let's say an ulnar nerve or a sciatic nerve or a radial nerve, we're not talking about one particular nerve cell, rather we're talking about a bundle of nerve cells. So here we can see one single nerve cell, and just like in muscles we call a single one a fiber. You can have a bundle of nerve fibers and typically a larger bundle of more bundles of nerve fibers together. So any particular nerve that would be visible, that would be something you could actually see without a microscope, is going to be comprised of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual nerves all bundled together. We've seen an image sort of like this when we looked at muscles. We had the synapse, the connection between, in this case, two nerves. In muscles, we saw that synapse between a nerve and a muscle cell. But either way, there's this little gap. It releases that neurotransmitter, and then that signals or stimulates the next nerve in line to pick up that message. And if it's a strong enough stimulus, it will then send that message on to the next nerve in line beyond that. So those connections, those are called synapses. And what we see in this image here at the top is a really cool image of axon terminals. Those are the little connections from the bottom of, let's say, an axon to the, in this case, the cell body of the next nerve in line, but it could easily be a dendrite it's connected to as well. So this particular cell body has lots and lots of synapses. So lots of different neurons are connecting with this one. And so when you talk about brain and brain power or the brain's processing ability, you're really talking about how many of these synapses are there. How many different nerves are interconnected with other different nerves. And the more nerve connections you have in the brain, the greater its processing ability. So you might consider someone who's very, very intelligent. they might have lots and lots of these connections, and someone who's perhaps not quite so intelligent might actually literally have fewer synapses in the brain. So the more connections the brain has to itself, literally the smarter the person has, at least the capability of being. Just like in a muscle contraction, we had the neurotransmitter released, and then that stimulated an action potential. The same sort of thing is going to happen with the nerve. So for the nerve to send a signal, it must generate this action potential, this electrical current. And so what we see here in figure A is we have an electrical charge of -70, and then after we've had some stimulus, we have a charge of -55. So it's actually increased the voltage on this particular nerve cell by somewhere around 15 or so millivolts. If we change that even farther, we can get more and more of an electrical current generated. And as you can see down here, we've got these little sodium and potassium channels opening and closing, and as the voltage changes, the little channels change. A certain voltage will open a sodium channel, a certain voltage will open a potassium channel. But the point is, as those sodiums and potassiums trade places, they stimulate the continuation of this electrical current. And the muscle was working the same way. I don't think we mentioned necessarily sodium and potassium channels, but that's what was happening in the muscle as well, to continue this electrical current down the cell. And so here is a couple of nerve cells here, and that electrical current has been generated. So the action potential is traveling down that particular nerve, sending a signal. And what we see here as well, these blue cells are Schwann cells. And Schwann cells are insulator cells. And it turns out that the more insulated a cell is, the faster it sends its signal. And the insulation on these nerves is the same function that insulation in electric wires in your house is. And that is to keep that electrical current inside the nerve and don't let it jump out randomly. Because if it jumps out randomly, just like in your house, it will short circuit and it will cause unintended, undesirable effects to occur. So that insulation is very important. So this insulation is increasing the speed at which that signal travels, and it's also decreasing the rate at which the signal loses intensity. The farther a signal travels, the weaker it gets. But in this case, if we have lots of insulation, that prevents the weakening of that signal at such a rapid rate. And so that means we don't have to recharge the signal as often. So in between these insulating cells, we might have to recharge the signal. But within the insulating cell, there's no need for recharge of the signal because, again, the insulation is preventing the decay or the loss of voltage of that signal. So heavily insulated nerves send signals faster. They also send them with less decay, less loss of intensity, which means that you can go farther without having to add more voltage to the situation. The brain is probably the most complicated thing that we know of, certainly the most complicated organ, and perhaps more complicated than anything else in the universe. And so we could spend literally weeks talking about the brain just to share what I know. And there's far more about the brain that I don't know. So if we really were to consider all the things that humans do know about the brain, we would be here all semester just studying the brain. But we're going to do just a couple of different things here, just a couple of highlight thoughts. And the first one here is this idea of the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And you see here the RAS, and its job really is to take incoming information to the brain and decide what to do with it. Decide, is it important or not? Should we pay attention to this or not? Or should we just simply ignore it? And it's not that the brain isn't aware that something came in, but it's chosen to not ignore it completely, but ignore it to the point where you're not consciously aware of it. So the reticular activating system is really important for one's awareness of their environment. And so this is one of the reasons why a lot of people like it to be very quiet and distraction-free while studying. It's so that the reticular activating system doesn't have to try to ignore so much information coming in while it's trying to focus on whatever it is you're trying to study. Some people, however, have a reticular activating system that is very capable of tuning things out. So for me, if I'm really deep into a good book, you can say something to me right there in the same room with me, and I might not hear it. Doesn't mean my ears didn't detect it. Doesn't mean the auditory part of the brain didn't light up and process that information. But the reticular activating system said, don't pay attention to that. It's not important. So when you're driving down the road, are you actually noticing every single car that drives past? In terms of, hopefully you're aware that there's a car there, but are you noticing that's a Toyota Corolla and it was white, and this is a Honda Accord and it's yellow, and there's a blue Chevy Silverado? Odds are you're not really paying attention that much, because the reticular activating system is saying, not important. But if a really shiny, really fancy, really expensive car comes along, the reticular activating system might say, hey, take a look at that, because that's not the normal. We're not bored with that. So the reticular activating system is also involved to some degree in how long you continue to pay attention to something based on, is it bored? And if it's bored with something, it will pretty much tune it out. Again, the information is still coming in, but you're not consciously aware of it because it's sort of saying, yeah, just shove that off to the side, not important. For some people with neurological conditions, and let's say Tourette's syndrome is a wonderful example of this, the reticular activating system fails to function like it should. And in many cases, folks with Tourette's actually fail to filter out, fail to ignore stuff that's not important. So what you or I probably would never really notice or pay attention to certainly wouldn't overwhelm us with the thoughts of it because we weren't really focusing on it that much. Someone with Tourette's can't possibly ignore it. And it's just as significant to that person's brain, and it's shoved just as significantly into their conscious awareness as it would be for us if something very dramatic and very significant to us were to occur. But for this person with Tourette's, every single detail in the environment is presented that way. So they can't really turn off their awareness. They can't really ignore stuff. Everything is forced on them. And so that becomes very psychologically stressful and overwhelming when you can't turn it off. Some other aspects of the brain, besides just pieces and parts, is the higher level brain function. And so when we get into higher level brain function, we get into the limbic system. And the limbic system is going to be down here in the middle front of the brain primarily, and towards the frontal part of the brain. And it's going to be involved in the high level stuff like emotion, like memory, like speech, like all those high level processing sorts of things are going to occur in the limbic system. So let's think about memory. Memory really comes in a couple different forms. You're most familiar with the idea of short-term memory and long-term memory. And just like its name suggests, short-term memory is only for a very short period of time. Really, about 8 pieces of information is what short-term memory can handle. The average number of words in a sentence. Someone's telephone number. That sort of thing, if you hear it, you could immediately spit it back because short-term memory can handle it. But as soon as, let's say, the 9th piece of information comes in, the first piece gets deleted to make room. And as soon as the 10th piece comes in, the 2nd piece got deleted to make room. Because, again, you've only got about an 8-piece capacity. So that means if you don't convert what's in short-term memory to long-term memory, once it's deleted as the next piece comes in, it's gone forever. So the challenge is, how do you convert more efficiently from short-term memory to long-term memory? How do you convert from I just read it in the book so I know it to I can remember it on the test? That's perhaps a little bit more of a challenge. So we'll get into some ideas for that in just a little bit here. Some other kinds of memory would be something like semantic memory, and that would be numbers and words, basically facts and figures. And that's something, as preparation for your test, you want to be involving semantic memory so that you can remember these things like, what does the reticular activating system do? That's a fact sort of idea. Episodic memory would be something like remembering a person, remembering a place, remembering an event, or remembering a person at a particular event that was at a particular place would be an episodic memory, a memory of something that actually occurred. Skill memory might be involved in something like riding a bike or playing a musical instrument. And then you also get into an idea called motor memory. And I'm not sure that you can really fully separate skill memory and motor memory and say they're two different things. Because skill memory is how to ride a bike. But motor memory is what do your legs need to do to turn the pedals, and what does your body need to do to balance the bicycle. So really those are sort of not able to be separated kinds of skills. To play a piano, obviously you have to know how. That's a skill memory. But the motor memory puts your hand in the right place to find the right key at the right time without looking. And that's definitely a motor function of learning where to move your hand, and if you put it there, it will always be right. So skill memory and motor memory are kind of tied together in a permanent sort of way. So let's talk about long-term memory. What can you do to enhance your ability to convert things from short-term to long-term memory? And there's a couple things you can do, and the one you probably do most is called repetition. And so the more often you put something into short-term memory, the more likely it is to eventually find its way into long-term memory. So this is where flashcards come in. This is where simply reading the chapter 2 or 3 times comes in. Taking notes, then reading your notes again. So most of what you associate with studying is actually repetition. And the thought is, again, the more often you put it in short-term memory, statistically speaking, the more likely it is to eventually end up in long-term. And that works, but that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of effort, so it's not overly efficient. Another thing you can do to improve long-term memory conversion is you can associate a piece of information with something you already know, that you already have in long-term memory. So this class, perhaps there's been some association that occurs. You all know something about the human body because you have one. And you've observed your own body and it doing things or not doing things. You've seen other people with health problems, so you have some knowledge of the human body already. And then if you're able to take this information that might be completely new to you, but then connect it to something that you already knew a little bit about or a little bit of, now you say, oh, okay, I already knew this. This new piece plugs in with that old piece like this. Now I get it. It's associated, it's connected, and that's something that's relatively easy to do for a lot of subjects. Someone who is a good teacher actually goes to great lengths to help people find associations. So for this class, it sort of does it on its own. You're going to see things and recognize them as being somewhat relative to what you already knew, hopefully, and so part of that is taken care of for me. But some classes, let's say math, for example, isn't always obvious and immediately clear as to how that's relevant to something else. So a math teacher probably has a harder job teaching math because it is less obviously associatable material. So in math, probably what the teacher needs to do is actually help you to understand where in real life would this kind of math problem be used. And that then helps you associate the problem and the steps of the problem with something that's real, rather than just an abstract problem on paper that doesn't mean anything in real life. And for me, that was something that I really struggled with when I was learning math, was, yes, I can go through the steps of the process, but if I don't associate it, if I don't really see what the point is and what we're headed for, then it really is a lot more difficult. So association of new material with old material is a more powerful converter to long-term memory than simply repetition. So that's better. We can do better yet. My favorite kind of long-term memory conversion is the idea of emotional impact. Sometimes it's referred to as excitement. But if you can become emotionally involved in a piece of information, it almost certainly is going to go into long-term memory. Think about if you've ever been in a car wreck before. If you were conscious for the experience, you probably remember that in great detail. Not because you spent a lot of time and effort trying to remember it and trying to think about it again, trying to make sure you don't forget it, trying to make sure you can always pull it back out. You probably didn't do that, but you probably just remember it. Because the emotional impact was significant enough, it triggered a highly efficient conversion of that short-term information into long-term memory storage. So that required very little effort. It just almost magically happened. So I sometimes will deliberately invoke emotion in a particular topic, and that helps to convert that information for you to long-term. And it seems that negative emotions are more powerful than positive. So something that you're mad about, something that you're upset or frustrated with, something that you're scared of, those things are things that are going to more effectively convert to long-term memory and be stored there. Things that you were happy about, probably not as effectively stored in long-term memory. Doesn't mean positive emotion doesn't work, but it seems like for some reason negative emotion is a more powerful converter of information to long-term. Once the information is stored in the long-term memory, it seems that there is no limit to the brain's capacity. So there's no maximum data storage amount that the brain can do after which it's full. We can always keep putting a little bit more and a little bit more in there. The trick, though, is retrieving it when you want it. So once you put it in long-term memory, again, we believe that it doesn't disappear, but you may not be able to access it when you want. And sometimes this happens to you on a test. You're taking a test and you know the answer because you studied it 1,000 times while you were prepping and you got it right every time then. But for some reason your brain just can't pull it out in the middle of the test. And often what you discover as soon as you turn in that test, or as soon as you click the submit button on that test, the file is restored and all of a sudden you can find the information again. So sometimes the retrieval is tricky, but once it's in there, we believe it stays there. Now, the connections to it may become lost. So it may be stored there, but a lost file that you don't know how to connect to again. Things like, let's say, riding a bicycle or playing a musical instrument. Do you ever completely lose that if you don't do it? And the answer is not completely, but you may lose some of the connections to it so that you don't do a good job of it the next time you try. But you will find that if you've not played an instrument, let's say for 10 years, you sit down to play it and you find out that you're not doing a very good job of it, but if you put a little bit of effort into it, you will relearn it much faster than you learned it the first time through because it was still there. You just perhaps had to reprogram the pathways to get to that information and actually use it properly. So practice actually makes things better and it keeps it more readily available in that system. One thing I would like to make a point of talking about here is central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system was the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system was everything else. So all the nerves in the body that are not part of the brain or the spinal cord, that's peripheral nervous system. And the key thing there is that the central nervous system does not have the ability to repair itself, but the peripheral nervous system does. So if you damage the brain or spinal cord, it's permanently damaged and is not likely to repair itself because the insulation of central nervous system nerves actually inhibits repair. It prevents the cell from fixing itself even if it could and wanted to. Peripheral system nerves, with their insulation, the Schwann cells we've already seen, actually encourage nerve repair and regeneration. So if you cut a nerve, let's say in your arm, it may take a year or 2 or 3 for that nerve to regrow, but unless the damage was significant, it most likely will eventually regrow and repair itself. So you might find sensory functions slowly returning to an area that had lost it. And it's a very, very slow regrowth process, somewhere around 1 millimeter a day on the top end. So if the nerve had to regrow, let's say 15 inches, that would literally take years to achieve that. But there's always that hope of that nerve eventually regrowing. But in the central system, it's pretty much a done deal. And it's damaged, and whatever happened there is going to become a permanent condition. Again, we could spend weeks and weeks talking about the brain and spinal cord and nerves and how they work, but this is sort of a brief overview to the system, and hopefully you've developed a greater appreciation for it. And again, hopefully it all made sense and you learned a lot. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.